anthem for this morning. You know, in the days just before Christmas, really just a few years ago, back in 2022, Buffalo, New York was hit by a deadly blizzard. It dumped, if you can picture this, more than 50 inches of snow, 50 inches. So similar to the winter storm this weekend in large swaths of the country. But this particular storm, just over 3 years ago, stranded motorists, it shut down emergency services, and it left people literally fighting for their lives. And on December 23rd, a 27-year-old mechanic, and his name is Jay Whithy, he drove his truck out into this mess to help a friend whose car was stuck. But Jay never reached him. His own truck was soon buried in snow, and in the meantime, Jay noticed a whole lot of other people on the street who had become stranded, who were complete strangers to him, but he invited to get into his truck to stay warm with the engine running. Now, Jay called 911, but rescue crews could not reach them. So he went around that neighborhood knocking on doors, offering money, begging for any help, but no one let them in. By early Christmas morning, his truck had run out of gas, so no more heat. And still more people appeared, 7 elderly neighbors and 2 dogs. Desperate, Jay trudged through the snow to a school that was about 700 feet away, and he broke through a window and led those 24 people to safety. Inside, they found heat and food and restrooms. By Christmas Day, as the storm lifted, Jay used the school snowblower to clear the cars of the survivors. And before leaving, though, he taped a note to the door of the school. It said, "To whomever it may concern, I'm terribly sorry about breaking the school window and for breaking into the kitchen, but I had to do it to save everyone and get them shelter and food and a bathroom. Merry Christmas, Jay." Now, Jay is remembered as a hero, and rightly so. But what stands out to me is not simply the heroism, it is the risk that he took. Jay risked himself for a friend, and in doing that, he ended up saving dozens of strangers. So real storms, blizzards, hurricanes, and the metaphorical storms of life are just unavoidable. When they hit, we sure do like to have explanations for them. If we can trace the cause, we feel like maybe we've regained a measure of some control over the inexplicable. Of course, sometimes there is no explanation. One home is destroyed by a tornado while the next one is left untouched. A scary diagnosis arrives just out of the blue. A relationship crumbles despite our very best efforts. And when chaos strikes, our instinct can be to circle the wagons, to retreat into safety, and to avoid further risk. It's understandable, but not always helpful. Because human beings we're creatures of hope. We thrive on that. Without hope, we just wither. And hope is only possible because we have this wonderful capacity to imagine what the future might hold. Now, sometimes our imagination can tilt toward fear. We can project yesterday's sorrows onto tomorrow, but other times it leans toward possibility, like each day is an open door. Most of us live somewhere in between those extremes, cautious optimism. But what about Jay, that mechanic hero from Buffalo? On that snowy night, he risked everything, not because he knew how things were going to turn out, but because he refused to ignore the needs that were right there in front of him. And this week, that made me think of another group of ordinary people who once made a similar decision, fishermen who dropped their nets to follow this wandering preacher. Now, the way a lot of us heard this story at first, Jesus walks by these total strangers and says, "Follow me," and the fishermen abandon everything, boats, nets, their livelihood, without a second thought. I think the reality was probably more complex. Matthew tells us that Jesus had moved to Capernaum, a small town where everybody knew everyone. And by then he was already preaching, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven has come near." So word about him would have spread. Those fishermen, Peter and Andrew, James and John, they had likely heard of him, maybe even had spoken with him. And still, they could not have ignored him. They had families and steady work and daily routines. Why would you walk away from all of that, especially when it was dangerous? Because this story begins right after the arrest of John the Baptist, and everyone knew John was arrested for criticizing powerful people. And Jesus was carrying on John's mission in his own style, only slightly less confrontational than John's way of doing things. For both John the Baptist and Jesus, their talk of God's kingdom was good news for common people, but it was threatening to the rule of authorities and religious leaders. So these fishermen, they were not naive. They knew the risks. Following Jesus might cost them a whole lot more than their livelihood. It might cost their lives. But they followed him anyway. Why? Because following Jesus meant being drawn into a life larger than they had ever imagined before. They would meet people they had been taught to despise. They would eat with the deplorables, tax collectors and sinners. They would heal and be healed. They would be asked to unlearn and relearn what it means to be faithful, to be in relationship with the holy. Most of all, they would glimpse a God who could make the impossible possible. A God whose love has no limits, no boundaries, no one left behind. Matthew does not tell us this story as some kind of quaint anecdote. He tells it to explain the discipleship itself, that following Jesus always involves a risk. It always means leaving something behind. Now, it might not be our livelihood that we're leaving behind, and it might not mean that we're risking our lives in a literal sense, but a life of following the path of Jesus does require a decision. Really, I think of it as many small decisions every day that are risky, because all of those choices change us. They move us in fresh directions. They open our minds and our hearts. They bring new life and justice and hope into the world. A decision like leaving behind our need to always be right. Dropping our nets that represent following the path of least resistance. Especially dropping our nets of doing things the same way we've always done them while expecting brand new results. A life of faith is about deciding to walk away from the security of believing that some people are unworthy, or that because they don't look like us or agree with us or different from us or come from different countries, that God does not accept them and love them completely and we should treat them accordingly. A life of faith is about deciding that merely reading the news and being worried and appalled and frustrated is not enough. And for those who are able, acting on our faith includes the simple but still risky work of standing with each other and our neighbors in shared resolve for peace and sanity and justice and just plain old loving kindness. Our nets need to be dropped to be people and to be a church that is relevant to the needs of our friends, neighbors, family members, and coworkers who are seeking belonging and community and meaning and purpose, who are seeking a just cause in which they can belong. And I know it's not always easy to drop our nets, especially those nets that we see as absolutes, and open ourselves to how God is still speaking and making things brand new in the world. It can feel risky, but I believe we are called to drop those nets of safety and security and to take a sacred journey into the new opportunities God's creating every single day. And we never know absolutely what's in store when we venture out into that weather, It might mean loosening our net of nostalgia, the illusion that the past was perfect, and opening ourselves to how God is still creating and still calling us today. It might mean releasing the net of apathy, that quiet voice that so often says, well, someone else will take care of this. Others will stand up for this. Following Jesus calls us to risk stepping forward, not waiting for somebody else. Would those fishermen have followed if they had known everything that lay ahead, the betrayals, the cross, the long road of sacrifice? Maybe not, but they followed anyway. Not because they knew the whole path, but because they trusted in the one calling them and walking beside them. And that is still our invitation. You know, churches do not exist to provide safe, easy answers. It's really true. We're here to be comforted by our mutual love and care, to be supportive of one another, and to be confirmed in the way of God's love for us. That's joyful, but it's not our whole job here. If the gospel really matters to us, if we call ourselves people of the way of Jesus, we are here to follow. We're here to act. Not because we have it all figured out, but because God calls. Not because it's our way or the highway, but because Christ leads. Not because it's comfortable, but because it's faithful. And the truth is, Jesus, well, he not only asked fishermen to take a risk on him, he also took a risk on them. And God continues to take a risk on us. And that is good news. Because as much as we may stumble sometimes, the one who calls us also equips us. Strength, wisdom, courage, hope, all these are given to us along the way. And the journey is never, ever taken alone. And maybe that's what gave those first disciples courage, a sense that this rabbi could be trusted to walk with them and see them through anything. My mother-in-law, Pauline Durrett Robertson, well, she once wrote a poem. She's a great poet. And she once wrote a poem called A Decent Life. And I like it so much, I might have shared it with you before. It's worth repeating, I think. It goes like this. I was counting my fish when I thought I heard him call to me. But of course, only a fool would lay down the nets of his trade to follow a dreamer. And for all these years, I've been right here, counting fish. I do not want to look back on life and say, I was content to stay safe, content to spend my precious days counting fish. And as we begin a brand new year of our church's life with our annual meeting after worship today and a lunch to celebrate our wonderful life together, my hope is that you feel the same way. Every year opens up before us the opportunity to put our sacred thinking caps on, to be open to God's spirit of creativity, to dream large and to plan boldly and to act courageously. The Sufi poet Rumi put it this way: you were born with potential. You were born with goodness and trust. You were born with ideals and dreams. You were born with greatness. You were born with wings. You're not meant for crawling, so don't. You have wings. Learn to use them and fly. Now, flying is risky, just like following is risky, but risk is the essence of faith. Not certainty, but trust. Let's not waste our time ever counting fish. Let's risk following. Let's step out into storms, into hope, into God's newness. Let's drop our nets and let's fly. Amen.